back to the Holistic Success Show, where we introduce expert insights on engaging topics in higher education. I'm Anshu Visan Singh, and this season we are diving into Success Reimagined, a theme dedicated to reshaping what it truly means to thrive in today's dynamic educational landscape. Today, we are continuing our conversation on a big idea in higher education, competency based medical education, or CBME. Building off our previous conversations this season, we'll be moving from theory into real world practice. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome back Sylvia Mioduszewska, our Senior Product Enablement Specialist at Acuity Insights. Sylvia works closely with our partners on program management and has a deep understanding of both the theory and the practical implementation of CBME. Welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you, Anju. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you back here. All right. Okay. So last time we talked about CBME in theory. For this episode, what we really want to do is dig into what it actually looks like when programs take it from concept to practice. So a lot of programs think implementing CBME is about picking a tool and rolling it out. But you've stressed that it's about building an intentional program of assessment. So what does that actually look like in practice?
I think most programs already have a solid handle on the idea of a program of assessment. It's not a new concept. I'm going to say it's rare, probably impossible to see a medical student or other healthcare professional, to be honest, promoted on the basis of one single data point per phase, per rotation, etc. What's shifting now, though, I think, is the expectation that those assessments are mapped to some sort of national competency framework and more consistent across organizations. And that mapping also then strengthens trust in the process for the public. There's that public accountability, and then also makes it possible to see how those local assessments roll up to broader standards. And that's, I think, what's really shifting in that program assessment is now being tied to something bigger.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for getting us started with that. So, once programs commit to CBME, the challenge becomes balancing quality with burden. So, how can programs design assessments that give real insights without overwhelming learners or faculty with too much repetition or noise?
Oh, Andrew, that's $1 million question. You're diving right in. I think the key factor is thinking in terms of, again, that program assessment and thinking about multiple smaller assessments that feed into something bigger. And so the most effective programs rely on frequent low stakes assessments, ideally formative ones that roll up into larger summative judgments at the end of a rotation, a phase, a stage, a year, whatever that metric might be. And those smaller assessments, especially workplace-based assessments like entrustable professional activities or EPAs, they need to be easy to complete in the moment. They should follow SMART principles, be quick to initiate, and be dead simple to complete on a mobile device. You want them to be really easy, fast, and repeatable very quickly. But the flip side of that is now the programs have extra data and they need to actually be able to simply review that data and do it frequently so they can actually get that stepwise approach along the path. It allows them to spot learners who maybe are struggling and give them support early. And otherwise, you don't really catch those things that might lead to remediation, exam failures, or other things that are much bigger to try to fix.
So many good observations and tips in that response that you gave, Sylvia. So, can you actually walk us through an example of how a single tool like an EPA or procedure log might serve both formative and summative purposes and what it takes to use it responsibly?
I think while EPAs and logs and other types of formative assessments should ideally function as assessments for learning, the reality of CBME is that programs need more data that they can practically collect in a given phase of their program. So that often means that those formative assessments wind up being used to inform summative decisions and are no longer truly assessments for learning. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the key is transparency. So you should be clear with your learners about how that data is going to be used as not entirely formative, and then design systems that mitigate those unintended consequences of using formative assessments for summative decisions. So you want to make sure that you still have a way to enable your learners to seek feedback without penalty, right? Because if they think it's going to be used in a summative way, they might not actually seek out those assessments. They might wait until they feel that they've mastered a certain procedure or task before asking for assessment. And you want your committees to look at patterns instead of just isolated low scores or outliers. And so I think you want those things in place. And then you also want to be talking to your faculty about providing narrative comments that actually add context. That qualitative information is really, really key. That it really tells you a lot more. It's a lot richer than the quantitative scores on assessment forms. And so I think that when you have clear systems and fair systems, learners don't feel the need to game the process, and programs still get the data they need for growth and decision making.
Great points. Thank you for sharing that, Sylvia. So, you've seen programs struggle when trying to implement CBME. What's one pitfall you've seen, and how could programs have designed it differently?
I think it's really easy to stumble. There's a lot of bigger and smaller pitfalls along the way. But one I think that I would really caution programs strongly against is using the same assessment tool again across long phases of training. And so, for example, use it across more than an entire year in undergraduate medical education, for example. I think when you have those kinds of assessment tools, they tend to be too vague for faculty. They don't know what's expected from a third year clerk versus a fourth year acting intern, or from a PGY2 versus a PGY5. You want to make sure those forms actually mean something to the person filling it in, because a lot of our frontline faculty are not necessarily versed in the pedagogy. They need to have really clear assessment tools to help them say, okay, this is what I should be expecting from this learner. And then I think also when a form straddles those longer time frames, you start to lose leading indicators, right? So if a learner stays at level one, whatever level one is for program or your school, for 9 months, 12 months, or longer, I think if that's especially if it's one of your only data points, how can they or your program know whether they're on an upward trajectory, right? If that is expected to be at level one for a extended period of time because the form now goes into the next year and the next, how do you know what's happening? So I think there's lots of things you can do to augment that. It is a little more work for the program. You'll want to have, more stage specific assessment tools. You'll want to think about actually making sure that they include behaviorally anchored rating scales, like milestones. Maybe make sure your assessment questions, your rating items are really, really clear in terms of what's expected, because you want to give your faculty really grounded, concrete guidance on how to score a given encounter. And so you want to make sure that actually gives you meaningful data and not just simply something that's checked off. So I think that's the biggest one, is that really trying to do too much with one assessment over too long a period of time.
As we think about the learner's perspective, there's a very different sort of experience that they are going through with CBME. So, what does a well designed program of assessment feel like day to day? And how can it build trust and encourage growth instead of fueling anxiety?
I think in terms of that idea of learner growth and supporting that and trying to make sure that we're not actually fueling them into more anxiety, because we know students, especially in all health professions programs, really struggle with trying to really be perceived and seen, and actually are the brilliant humans that they are. And so I think it's really similar in any field, including here at Acuity. We all need frequent, truly low stakes feedback. And we talked about that also having dual purpose, but we'll hold off for a second so that we know we're on the right track. And so, those learners, they should never reach the end of a rotation or us in a quarter, for example, and be surprised by something that they didn't know that they were or weren't doing. Those things really should be documented along the way in those lower stakes assessments. We are pretty good at showing learners what their expectations are, but we want to do so in a language that matches their day to day. So as we talked about grounding those frontline faculty in our assessments, those are also for the learner as well. If that's really clear what's expected, they can look at that assessment tool and say, oh, this is the piece I missed, or this is the piece I should be thinking more about. And so you really want to think about those aspects of clarity. And then I think beyond that, you need to have predictable rhythms of feedback and review. And so that's also obviously within a rotation, for example, you want to make sure they're actually given actual feedback in addition to the assessment at the end of the rotation. Those smaller assessments along the way. And then you want to make sure that your progress, your competence committee meetings, your promotion committee meetings, they're at standardized times so learners know when those things are coming and then know when they'll be getting more of that summative feedback along the way as well. And so it makes feedback routine, it's expected, and that makes, I think, everybody feel more supported in their growth rather than judged along little things along the way that maybe they didn't think were that important. And so I think we want to consider those things as well as we start layering in all of these extra assessments, all these more formative type assessments. There's a consideration as well that we've heard from GME programs in Canada that are really moved to EPAs, and that's that their residents feel constantly watched and judged. And that's really been taking a toll on their mental health. And so I think we, like with all places, we need to balance getting enough data with learner wellness. Without that consideration, we can really put those learners in a much more anxiety fueled state.
Yes, I mean, and assessment design plays such an important role, right? In helping learners understand what the whole entire journey looks like, what's really high stakes, what's not, and just feel comfortable as they're going through that whole journey of formative assessment. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sylvia. So for programs just beginning the CBME journey, what's the smallest, most impactful first step they can take to start moving from theory to practice?
I'll preface this by saying I think no steps in CBME are truly that small. So I'm gonna caveat what I think is the answer with that statement. That's why we're here to help and talk through these things. I think the best starting point is to understand what your current assessments are really telling you. And that can be something as, and we did a really great exercise on this in a recent workshop that we did this summer, where we asked participants to take a typical assessment item on a form and try to map it across competencies and enabling competencies. And for example, we had one question which looked fairly simple on the assessment itself, but actually mapped to, I think it was 3 competencies and 10 enabling competencies. And so that one question was doing a lot of work. Again, that's okay, but you need to know that's what it's doing so that you can then make those defensible decisions and also maybe start thinking about where you can layer in something like a very simple formative EPA style assessment to give you more data points to feed into that question. And then sort of thinking about that. And so that's a big thing, right? Look at your assessments. What are they telling you? And where can you get richer data without overburdening your program is really that first step. And that really helps you build some momentum. It creates alignment with the competency framework. So you still have to think about those as well. But I think the first step really is looking at your assessments. That's step 2. And then lay that foundation for that stronger program of assessment.
Through all of these episodes, there's a lot of like really pearls of wisdom that fall out of your mouth. But I know that you've also been working on a guide, to competency-based medical education. It's filled with practical tools and so on. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that guide?
Oh, thank you. So I've alluded to that a little bit. We've been talking to programs a lot more specifically with CBME. We've been hearing a lot about how do we do this with the new foundational competencies coming out as well. We've heard a lot more, questions and thoughts. And so we've been speaking to programs and trying to find out what their problems are, what's been working, what hasn't been working. And we've gathered all those lessons through all the direct consultations and research and community discussions and brought together what is very large guide, but is very, very rich with information in terms of both theory and practice, and also one of the pitfalls that we've discussed along with others. And so we try to bring together all those insights into one place so that our partners can start thinking about those steps as they really kind of either begin their CBME journey or perhaps enhance it and move to the next level.
Yeah, thank you to you and some other colleagues as well that have helped put this together. And that's why we do these kinds of episodes so that we can give you some bite-sized information, but a whole lot of other knowledge is actually existing in that guide. Make sure to check our show notes so that you can know where to get this guide. It's rich with lots of great information. And Sylvia, this has been such a valuable conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anju. It's been great to be here.
Thank you. And thanks to all our viewers and listeners for joining us. We will be bringing Sylvia back in short order to continue this conversation on so many things related to CBME. Don't forget to subscribe to the Holistic Success Show, and we will see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Holistic Success Show, please be sure to check out our other episodes. We have episodes coming out regularly all the time, so please be sure to subscribe so that you can stay up to date on all things related to student and program success in higher education.